Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. I'm just going to wait a minute or two so everyone's had time to join, but you're in the right place. Okay, right. So thank you very much everyone for joining us this afternoon. My name's Phoebe Weston. I'm a biodiversity reporter at The Guardian and very happy to be chairing this joint webinar between the PFLA, the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, and Plantlife. And it is the fifth in a series on wildflower meadows. Today we're going to be hearing specifically about the management and restoration of meadows on floodplains. The PFLA is a membership organisation of farmers, many of whom are managing species-rich grassland, and Plantlife is works to encourage the restoration and preservation of these very special habitats. I'd like to thank the main organisers behind this event, Emma Rothero and Olivia Nelson from the Floodplain Meadow Partnership from the Open University. So we've got 5 presentations, each one's going to be about 10 minutes long, and then we're going to have a time for Q&A at the end. So I think half an hour Q&A, our total time is going to be around an hour and a half. So if you type your questions into the Q&A box, not the chat, that would be great. Please ask as many questions as you possibly can. We've got Emma and Olivia are going to answer questions as we go along, and then if there are questions for specific speakers or complex questions or things that keep coming up, I'll try and field them at the end. And as I say, we'll try and get around to as many of them as we possibly can. So we've got a selection of researchers and farmers working in this area. So hopefully we'll hear lots of different points of view. I'm going to introduce each person just before they speak. I'm going to keep my introductions brief, so please do feel free to mention anything I may have forgotten. We're going to start with David Gowing, who is a professor of botany at the Open University. He's going to talk about the distinctiveness of floodplain meadows and talk about the work undertaken by the Floodplain Meadows Partnership. Now, before David starts, we're very keen on audience interaction, and we've got a poll, which we've actually got 3 polls tonight, which I've never done before, so we'll see how these go, but hopefully something should pop up on your screen now, which is the first poll. And if you click your answers, and then David is going to start talking. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Phoebe. I hope my slides are on the screen. So thanks to the PFLA and Plantlife for this opportunity. I'm currently director of the Floodplain Meadow Partnership, which has been running for about 15 years, and its aim is to promote floodplain meadows. And so for this first 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about what is special about meadows in floodplains rather than meadows generally, which this series has been discussing. Okay, so this is what we're talking about, a floodplain meadow near Oxford with incredible diversity, one of the most diverse plant communities in the UK, 40 species of plant per square metre in places. But what's really unique about them is they're also very productive. They can produce 6 tonnes to the hectare of dry matter each year with no artificial inputs, and can sustain that productivity for centuries. So that makes them really unique in terms of an agricultural resource. Okay. Historically, they were probably the dominant land use in floodplains since the early Middle Ages. And As you can see from the map here, there are a couple of hundred sites left that still support typical floodplain meadow vegetation, but their total extent is now just 3,000 hectares, and we're estimating that that's probably only 1% of their former extent. So huge swathes have been lost, and most of that probably in the last 80 years. So they were managed consistently for hay each year with a cut and with aftermath grazing. And some sites have recorded histories going back almost 1,000 years to doomsday, such as this one, North Meadow Cricklade. And it gave rise to a very specific plant community through this consistency of management. But we think the tide is now turning in terms of most of the remaining examples do have some form of protection, and there's increasing interest in restoring this habitat type. We're aware of several hundred hectares that are currently under restoration, which will make a real difference to the resource we have in the country. So this graph comes from a particular restoration attempt, Clattinger Farm in Wiltshire, with the Wiltshire Wildlife Trust, where we monitored the success of the trial over a large number of years. So this was a pasture that was converted to meadow management, and green hay was spread. And you can see from the graph on the left that species richness increased by about 40% in just 4 years, and continues to drift upwards towards the old hay meadow in an adjoining field. So this shows that there are some quick wins in terms of introducing new species to a grassland, but to get full restoration is a very long-term process. Another site, in fact, the one we saw earlier from North Meadow and Cricklade, that we've monitored at fixed points continuously for the last 23 years, shows some interesting patterns. So here we're looking at the mean species richness of the meadow, and what we can see from the arrows at the bottom is where there have been particularly prolonged flood events. You see a distinct drop in the species richness in response. And that's largely due to if a cut was missed due to the flooding. And so the smaller species tend to drop out. And also because of nutrients being delivered, making the grasses more competitive. But you can see a flood cycle happening where you do get that dip directly after a flood, but then the diversity starts to recover. I think there's been a downward trend in the last few years because we've had a series of quite major flood events in quick succession. So we're not getting full recovery before the next one hits. But yeah, that may be a feature of climate change, I guess. But it does have implications for management in terms of allowing floodwaters onto the meadow is a good thing, but encouraging them to flow off as quickly as possible once the flood has passed. Benefits the diversity of the meadow. Another thing we've studied in some detail is the nutrient budget, and we're particularly interested in phosphorus because the availability of phosphorus in the soil seems to determine the plant community that grows. So in this example, again at North Meadow, that we've done it on several sites, we've measured how much phosphorus comes out in the hay crop each year, how much is delivered in the flood deposited sediments, how much is available in the soil, both before and after the hay crop. And so for this particular year, 2003, a lot more came out in the hay than went in sediment, and yet the availability stayed almost constant, which suggests that phosphorus was mobilized from insoluble stores. But over a sort of 10 to 20-year cycle, it tends to be that sediment delivers as much nutrient as the hay crops take out. And so these systems remain in balance. And that's how they can persist with high yields for centuries. If you tried to make hay every year on more upland meadows, they would tend to exhaust themselves unless you added nutrients in. Okay, and the reason why these plant communities are so productive and so sustainable and resilient to different weather conditions is their diversity. So having so many different plants growing cheek by jowl leads to really efficient exploitation of the soil profile. And you can see from this drawing the diversity of root systems. All these species are reasonably common in a floodplain meadow. And a particular thing to note is the depth of some of these root systems extending down over 2 meters, which means they're resilient to dry years, and you get a reasonable crop even in a dry year. And it also means that they're able to deposit carbon deep into the profile where it's much less likely to be oxidized and re-released. And these are some measurements we've made on floodplain meadow compared to other land uses. And in the current climate, with the headlong rush towards planting trees, it's worth flagging that soils beneath these meadows seem to contain more carbon than those beneath woodlands. And therefore, there's a case to be made that in the right situation, grasslands and these meadows are possibly a better mitigation technique than planting trees. But that data is not yet published because we've in the process of gathering more from a wider range of meadows to make sure that the results are robust, and we hope to have that published by the end of the year. Okay, so that was something of a whistle-stop tour of what's special about floodplain meadows. I'm showing here the members of the partnership. So many of the organisations interested in conserving and restoring the meadows have got together to pool resources and information, which is what the partnership is for. And we've distilled our research from the last 10 years or so into a handbook that's available online. And here are some contact details, so you can get the handbook via the website. Just to recap, what's really special about meadows in floodplains is they do support a unique plant community. They give us sustainable yields. They have a very rich cultural history. They provide opportunities to mitigate against climate change. They have rather unique nutrient dynamics because they're receiving flood deposits, and unique water regimes because, again, cycle of floods and dry years. And all of that means they need some particular management, and we hope our handbook will help people who are currently managing. We'd be happy to talk to anyone who has questions about management, and particularly anyone who is currently restoring a meadow or planning to do a restoration, because we have a project that aims to gather information from all the restoration projects across the country in order to distill what might be best practice, what works and what doesn't. So on that note, I'll hand you back to Phoebe, and I think she has another poll for you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, David. That was very interesting. I was extremely surprised there's only 3,000 hectares of floodplain meadow remain. That seems amazing. So as David says, we are doing our second poll now, which should flash up in your screen shortly. And in the meantime, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Claire Hill, who's Director of Regenerative Agriculture at FAI Farms, and specialises in the management and restoration of floodplain meadows. And particularly, she's been using mob grazing on them as well. So interested to hear about that. Claire, over to you.
Thank you. I'll just concentrate on getting my screen set up properly, and tell me if this works. Is that working?
Yes.
I'll assume yes. I'll assume yes. Okay, I'll go with that.
Yeah.
Okay, evening everyone. You can see I've picked a similar picture to David for my for my introductory slide, but this is a picture I took in June on Pixie Meadow, which is one of the SSSI meadows that we have under our management. Why is it not going to the next slide? Here we go. There we go. So I work at FAI Farms, and we look after, we farm about 1,200 acres of mostly pasture, and a significant proportion of that is floodplain. Some of it falling under SSSI designation, some of it not. The areas that I'm talking about are these areas here. These are not SSSI, and they were actually arable until probably 30 to 40 years ago, maybe not quite that long, and then they were returned to grassland. But the areas over the other side of the Thames, here, this is Yarnton Meadow and comes round into Pixie Meadow. These are SSSI floodplain meadows, and they are where you see the pictures of the incredibly species diverse meadows. So we're really lucky. We've kind of got two parts to what we do. I was going to touch on what we do and how we manage ours here. And so with the SSSIs on the meadows across the river, and then on our side, I say our side, it's because it's within our farm tenancy, and the other bit we just rent on a grazing license. But with the fields on the south of the Thames, we manage. They're not in SSSI, but they are in HLS. It can sometimes get a bit complicated, but I think if we did it back then, and we've done it since with other areas of the farm, but taking advantage of countryside stewardship schemes or other funding, and it looks like Elms would hopefully ongoing would have money available for restoration of these types of meadows, and that's what we did way back when. Which was great. And although I'll always be a bit cautious about some of the ones that prescribe cutting dates, that would be one of the things, because when we're cutting hay, that prescription makes it really restrictive, and particularly when mob grazing and using animal impact and planning and giving long rest periods, actually you could see that maybe some earlier grazing or earlier hay cutting might be more beneficial. But anyway, we do hay cutting, so we cut hay every year late on in the season, so that well, we had always thought we needed to do that and to allow the seeds to fall, but David since has updated me to say that there's such a good seed bank in these meadows that we don't really need to wait for that time anymore. And so ongoing, we're going to start thinking about pulling our hay cut earlier, although we do use the hay in a really planned way, in that we take it to other areas of the farm, and so cutting it late and having those seeds actually there means that when we feed the hay out, when we're bale grazing on other areas of the farm, we're taking that diversity from those meadows and placing it elsewhere in the area, and that works really well for us and also other farmers that are becoming more interested in regenerative farming. The other thing we're just starting to consider more is about, we've always taken a cut every year, but as climate change kicked in, I guess, and we get different levels of flooding in different years, we'll actually start to maybe cut more dependent on where the nutrient deposit has been. So if we haven't had any flooding, we might not be needing to take the hay cut away to reduce the nutrients on the land. So just a bit more of a kind of bespoke approach, I guess, rather than just blanket hay cutting across the whole area. Taking a slightly different approach appeals to us because we're really keen on regenerative agriculture. I'd say we jumped both feet in about 15 months ago, and so anything that's diverse and doing something a little bit different, it appeals to us now. One of the things that we did do to start to improve some of our floodplain meadows that maybe didn't have the diversity was to take green hay. So mowing the hay from the really species rich areas and then laying it out on the ground and letting the seeds fall. Also more classic reseeding, just scratching the surface and then sowing in. I would say that they have had some success, but as we all know, reseeding doesn't always work, especially when you've got long established grass there, and we're trying to get some really fine, small herb type seeds to grow on. It can be difficult. But I think when we were, that happened during the time that we were still set stocking, and I think on reflection, the reason it wasn't as successful as it could have been is because we just didn't allow the land the rest that it needed for those species to thrive. So we do have more diversity now since we did the reseeding and the green hay, and that's been a really good way to build it up. But I think grazing management on top of that is really key to maximise the benefits from it. And the way that we manage it from a grazing point of view, as I say, pre-2019 we were set stocking, and now we're high density mob grazing. I guess short period of time, a lot of animals in a long rest. We're aiming for between 3 and 6 months rest periods on the majority of our floodplain, all across the entire farm in fact, and then on the really species rich stuff, because it's so wet, across on Pixie and Yarnton, that only gets grazed once a year. And our although this isn't down on the floodplain, this is on our high ground. This is our bale grazing. Just showing this, as I'm sure everyone's familiar now with what regenerative grazing looks like, but just to show what the kind of model that we're working on and the sort of space and the types of animals that we've got on. So we're grazing cattle and sheep on twice daily moves around the farm, and as time goes on and we do more outwintering, the floodplains will become more important to us during the summer. So our outwintering is on our higher ground during the winter. We never dream of grazing the floodplains like this during the winter, but it means that we'll be focused even more on resting this high ground ready for winter, and making the best that we can from the lower ground. We've only been outwintering, this is our second winter, and everyone told us it'd never be able to do it on our farm, but here it is, and it doesn't look too bad. And that superficial damage from where the hay has been is hay from the SSSI meadows, so that's just extra carbon material that's been trodden in by the animals and added dung and urine and adding to the soil biology and taking those seeds down with them. So we'll be bringing more diversity to this land further up the farm. And this is just our sheep, mob grazing some sheep, but similar type of model. In the main, on half of our floodplains, we're only able to graze sheep really just because we're surrounded by roads, and the access isn't very easy. And I don't know if that's typical of other people's floodplain situations, but it's a bit scary to have cattle on the side of the A40 with only electric fence to keep them in. So at the moment we don't put cattle on the floodplains, but we are working with the landlords, of which I think our SSSI meadows are made up of about 15 different landlords. We're trying to work with them to look at how we can get fencing maybe funded under one of the schemes so that we would be able to put cattle, because another area of the farm that we manage is something called Alison's Meadow. We call it Alison's Meadow because Alison is the lovely lady that's been monitoring it for 30 years, and someone else will remind me of the proper name, I'm sure, in a minute. But Alison's Meadow is a block of land, this piece of land here, and actually within it are I think 8 different plots, and for over 30 years now they've been managed differently. So there's a cow, a sheep, and a no graze plot. So the whole field gets cut for hay every year, and then the plots are grazed in the same way every year. And what that's shown, being managed in that way, is that the most diverse areas are the ones that are grazed with cattle. So hay cut and grazed with cattle. Hay cut and grazed with sheep has some diversity, but a bit less because the sheep can be a bit more aggressive. But the areas where there's been no livestock have much less diversity than the cattle plots. So that just adds an interesting dynamic in for all of us livestock people out there. I'm probably coming towards the end of my time. These are just 2 of our soil samples. So this is our really species diverse Pixie meadow, with which mine and well, certainly my photo is from, and you can just see the root depth. David mentioned the depth there. I haven't, of course, dug down to 2 meters, but compared to the majority of the rest of our farm, our root structure sort of sits at the moment in this top layer, and we're doing everything we can with our grazing management to get those roots to go down deeper. But you can see over on Pixie how deep those roots go, and we all know how important that is for drawing down carbon, infiltration, holding water in the soil, etc., etc. The picture on the right is of one of our floodplain meadows, but would have been managed much more intensively. So there is some roots there, but it definitely doesn't go down as deep, and you can see it's much more compacted. So this is kind of like, this is what we're heading for now. We want everything on the farm to look like this and better. And hopefully with you taking the hay and doing the other things we're doing, trying to utilize that, we can get to this on the rest of the farm. That's our aim anyway. And this is just another lovely photo of a floodplain meadow, another one of Pixie, just a different angle. So even within the field, the diversity is huge. And a few years ago, when we were really focused on our dry matter and our ME, and we were all about kind of utilization of grass, we used to look at these meadows and think, oh, it's just a load of rough old stuff, and actually it's quite difficult to get in and make hay, and it doesn't have the productivity. I've only just realized I haven't got my video on, sorry. Hi everyone. And we didn't regard it as being our high quality hay, but since we started looking at from a regenerative angle, actually what we've learned is that the diversity in this brings many more benefits. And as we're learning more about nutrition and the way that works, in that the more where we just think about calories and we're just thinking about energy, then it's leading us to, as people, to overeat. But when we look at nutrient diversity and the nutrient density of food, then we realize that actually diversity is what drives that. And what we find is that when we do our dry matter calculations for the cows, when they're eating this species rich hay, they're actually eating a lot less than they are when they're eating hay from more monoculture type meadows. And so it kind of flips the whole more from less arguments on its head when we used to, in the way that we used to think about these meadows. So we're really excited about having them, and about everything that they can do for diversity and for farming, and for our health. That's it from me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Claire. That was very interesting. We've got a ton of questions coming in for you on the chat, but we're going to hold them for the moment. And also amazing pictures of the mob grazing, and I thought it was really cool. So we're going to go on now to hear from Kate Speck-Adams, who is Head of Land Use at the Wye Usk Foundation. And Kate is going to speak about the kind of support that they're able to give landowners and managers looking to create meadows in a floodplain. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you, Phoebe. Hi, everybody. I'm the wild card. I'm not talking directly about meadows. Mark said perhaps I was the teaser ram before he and Ben come in and talk about the other work that's going on in the Wye. So I'll leave that with you all. I'll just get my screen up on, hopefully you can all see that. This is part of the River Lug floodplain in Herefordshire on a beautiful sunny day a couple of years ago. We've got a really extensive network of floodplains in the Wye, about 10,000 hectares, which is considered to be at high flood risk, and nearly 90,000 properties that are in that floodplain area. 1,900 properties at high risk of flooding in that area. So there's a significant number of stakeholders that are interested in how the land around us is managed and the impact that has on our rivers. Most of the rivers in our catchment are designated as SACs, triple SIs, Natura 2000 sites. They're all extremely precious and have got some really rare fauna and flora, including water crowfoot and salmon, which you can see in our logo. We're a Rivers Trust, so we work on a really broad remit across the catchment itself. And we're just going to cover a few of those topics really to try and see how our work can complement the condition of the floodplains that so many of you are also managing. So I saw this really lovely model that has been produced by Ambiental, and they basically showed what our floodplain looks like on a section up north of Hereford. And it just shows how much our floodplain is active, and the fact that what we do upstream of it impacts on a large area of land. And what we're seeing really is that a lot of the intensification that's taken place up in the wider catchment is actually having quite a negative impact on the condition of the floodplain. A lot of the organic matter levels that we're seeing when we're visiting farmers, especially in the arable soils, have been depleted normally by about half compared to the permanent pasture on the same farm. And also the sort of damage that we're seeing to grassland in terms of compaction, obviously species diversity. And you might actually find that Mark and Ben aren't able to finish this presentation because the river is rising today. We had a lot of rain last night, and those floods are getting higher. They're much more frequent now because of the sort of different weather patterns that we're having, and the impacts that those floods are having on our species and habitats in the rivers is getting really severe. We're losing a lot of the sort of natural gravel beds. There's a huge amount of sediment being washed down in the floodwater, which chokes a lot of the gravels that all of our fish and invertebrates inhabit, and that has impacts all the way up through the food chain. And we're also seeing the impact of the really sediment-rich and very nutrient-rich water depositing out on the floodplain itself. So our work, as I said, is across the entire catchment, and a lot of our projects look at soil management and land management, really trying to enhance the sort of water holding capacity and the infiltration rates of the soils. We're looking also now at increasing water storage at any scale, whether it's, you know, large winter fill reservoirs or even small farm ponds which have been lost from the landscape. A lot of our work historically has been restoring the riparian habitat, and I'll show you a couple of examples of some of that work. Water quality, as I've said, phosphate is a big talking point for us in the Wye at the moment. It's having significant impacts with really, really severe algal blooms occurring every summer. And that means that our water crowfoot doesn't appear very often anymore. And then we're also trying to eradicate a lot of the invasive plants that seem to swamp our riverbanks. This is an example of one of the projects that's been running for a number of years, where our teams go out and spray giant hogweed as well as Japanese knotweed. And we're also now trialing the rust fungus that should help tackle Himalayan balsam. As you can see, the sort of map on the left shows hundreds of dots, which are all the different stands of giant hogweed that have been mapped and logged. And now, after many years, we're getting down to knowing them really by first name terms and getting down to the last couple of hundred stands. And each year, those guys go out and address those weeds, and finally, eventually, we'll be rid of them because they are just a pest and really do impact on the native fauna of our riverbanks. A lot of the work we're doing is also trying to protect riverbank where it's being damaged by stock. This is an example on the Lug. During a visit on that farm with the landowner, it was sort of discussed, what are the options? Water's a real limitation there. So one of the advisors sort of took that as a challenge. We don't really think that you can not get water. If you can source it from any number of things like pasture pumps. We use solar powered pumps to draw water out of the river. We can use boreholes, obviously main supply, and they, produce a plan a bit like you can see here on the right hand side, which identifies the fields that need fencing, all of the water that needs to be installed, and the costings. And then just to show you, as that has been completed, that was a year later. And now I'm delighted to say that was actually 2018. So you can imagine it's even better now. Just the improvement that we've seen from excluding the stock and allowing that to naturally recover has just been brilliant. And that's really what, a river that's protected under so many European designations should look like, certainly not what it did in 2015. We also do a lot of revetments where the damage has been done, particularly on sort of outside eroding corners, pinning in soft revetments and getting that bank protected, allowing natural regeneration to stabilise it. They have been really effective, and we've got a huge number of examples of those throughout the catchments and tributaries. My team, I've got 10 catchment advisors that go out and work with landowners on a sort of farm scale, trying to look at risk of runoff, soil health. We use this tool, which you can see on the right-hand side. It's called SciMap, which just basically maps topography and rainfall, just to show how water moves through the landscape. And we use that to identify high-risk areas for whether it might be muck heaps or where your gateway could be relocated. If it's going to be used for arable, whether we would be putting buffer strips in place, anything like that really, but also identifying the highest risk areas to have compaction, because that's where we're getting runoff happening and loss of soil. With all of these visits, we compile a sort of farm report, which has lots of opportunities and tries to identify as many of the different funding options that could support those recommendations. And I'm going to just have a look at some of those schemes now. About 60% of the farms we visit have funding schemes submitted after. So we're really pleased to have access to stewardship schemes, as well as the number of other ones we have in Herefordshire. As well as the sort of farm advice, we also have sector-specific projects. We have things like undersowing of maize, which we have 4 drills being offered as a service, and those go round the catchment now, and farmers can book in and use those when they have their maize planted. We do lots of on-farm events and discussion groups, and we work with a huge number of partners through the Farm Herefordshire initiative, especially Herefordshire Meadows group, as well as catchment sensitive farming and various other partners working in the area. Oh, sorry, that's jumped. So some of the stewardship schemes that we would be relying on, and I've tried to pick out as many of the sort of grassland type options as possible based on my audience tonight. So we're seeing quite a few of the buffer strip options, intensive grassland management, seasonal livestock removal, riparian management strips, all sorts of different options that could be explored, as well as management of wet grassland for breeding waders and the capital items that go alongside those. So, you know, that's the sort of funding we look to utilise when we're trying to support people in changing their management practices or making improvements to the infrastructure. So just to give you an idea, we are very fortunate because our river has so many designations. We're able to access the huge suite of water quality items through stewardship, and that means that in the last 3 years we've actually supported £14.5 million worth of applications, and that's delivered about 1,500 hectares of grassland options, about 195 hectares of priority habitats, including those priority grassland habitats, as well as some of our traditional orchards, nearly 150 miles of buffer strips, and then all the fencing and the water pipes and trough systems that we need to be able to protect the river from stock damage where it's getting poached on those banks, as well as a huge number of arable options and other capital items. We also try to utilise a lot of the other funding schemes. We work in partnership with Severn Trent Water, so we have their STEP scheme and their Booster for Biodiversity, and that we're really glad to see has also got lots of meadow creation. And on our own farm, on some of our flood meadows, we've been just adding in lots of new species and trying to get that a bit more species rich. So we've had some help from Herefordshire Meadows with that, and look forward to the spring to see what survives the flood, because it's underwater at the moment. We work with Tesco and a number of other retailers through part of the Court Hold 2025 commitment, where they're trying to reduce the impact of the supply chain on water, as well as funders, you know, the government bodies and Environment Agency, as well as those in Wales as well, because our catchment is cross-border, to really try and make sure that the funding that is available can be channeled down to land managers as much as possible and get that delivering the benefits on the ground. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Hopefully it gives you a bit of a warm-up to what you're going to see from Ben and Mark. And if you don't already work with a Rivers Trust, I would really recommend. We all come in different shapes and sizes. We have lots of different types of projects. So I can't promise that what I've shown you today will be available to everybody, but you can have a look on the Rivers Trust website and see who your local Rivers Trust is if you don't already work with them. And if I can be of any help, my details are on the screen.
Great, thank you so much, Kate. That was fascinating and interesting to hear what is going on at catchment level. Now we're going to talk to the two farmers. So we're going to start with Ben Taylor-Davies, who's a regenerative advisor and farmer in the Wye Valley. And he's decided to continue growing root crops in the floodplain, but has also done a significant amount of work creating flower-rich meadows. So Ben, over to you.
Thank you very much. Let's just hope this works. Okay. I presume it's working this time. Yep, great. Okay, so yes, I'm fortunate in that I'm a farmer in the area of outstanding natural beauty and the triple RSI, which is the River Wye. I happen to be a regenerative advisor too, and what we very much do here at Townsend is practice what we preach and start to demonstrate to people how we can do things slightly differently, or very differently in many cases, to actually have a sustainable future. We had a really strange conversation, me and my wife, about the future of growing potatoes at Townsend. I was very much for giving up growing potatoes because of the problems associated with soil and that sort of thing. My wife was more, she was more of an opinion that perhaps if anybody was going to do anything to regenerate potatoes and make sure that we weren't losing soil and phosphates and causing all sorts of pollution issues, then perhaps this is something that we should really focus on ourselves, especially as the government is looking at the moment and constantly this 5-a-day fruit and veg, and it just so happens that most of our 5-a-day is coming from the most polluted and degraded soils in the UK. So somewhere, somehow, we're going to have to come up with solutions where we end up with human health, but also health of the soil and health of our environment. So these photographs I'm showing at the moment were taken quite a while ago. Our farm has 2 distinct soil types. This is our sandy loam over sandstone, and a pretty typical photograph of winter wheat drilled after potato crops. And as you can see, water just pouring off straight, and the river is literally just behind me. So that was more of a tradition of what we were doing about 8 years ago. This is our other soil, which is some deep silt, along with its own problems. You can see that after winter and very much floodplain, we have some serious issues when considering the amount of floodplains and pollution we had there. Townsend Farm itself is located in the red area. The River Wye you can see snaking through, and the area I've highlighted in blue is where we are on the floodplain. So about just over a third of our farm is liable to flooding by the Wye. I think most people have looked at the headlines and the pollution problems and everything we're facing, and it's certainly been mentioned earlier today that the amount of phosphate that's ending up in the River Wye at the moment, 272 kilos a day. And when you just consider on a financial scale that comes to about £65,000 worth of phosphate being dumped into a river at any one time, I really can't understand how us as farmers could actually just look at that and think that's anything but a total catastrophe, despite and more so in actual fact what the damage it's doing to the environment. So it all started really when I started looking at, I did a Nuffield scholarship in 2016 and came back with a totally different view of farming, the world and food and everything else. And I've been thinking about drawing up a 30-year plan for an awful long time, 30 years, because I think that's probably how much energy I've got left. And the 30-year plan was very much based on the whole farm. How could we become a full regenerative farm? So it's hedge management, drainage, stock proofing, all of that. But of course, the most important thing for me is making sure my children, my children's children, and their children's children live in an area of outstanding natural beauty that still is and even more enhanced than what it is today. So putting the fun back into farming, as I put it, with regenerative farming, what have we done and how are we doing it? So we looked at our lowest lying fields, and we've got possibly some of the lowest lying fields on the River Wye. The reason I know they're probably lower than most is because they go underwater far quicker than we actually get a flood warning for. So these are very, very low-lying rivers, floodplains, and it's something we're going to have. We decided that we had to do something different. It was something that laid wet 4 or 5 months of the year, and profitable cropping was impossible. So in actual fact, if you were losing 7 crops out of 10, which is pretty much what we were, then there must be a better way. Therefore, in actual fact, surely the establishment of river meadows was going to be the future. The other things we're doing is putting flower-rich margins around every field we have. We use huge amounts of cover crops. And I saw in a question earlier talking about why don't we stop arable farming on floodplains? Interestingly enough, I use my arable crop to capture soil. I grow huge biomass crops of cover crop on all of my floodable arable land. Believe it or not, that traps huge amounts of sediment from other people's farms. So I actually end up with net gain from growing really big biomass cover crops through the winter and literally fishing for soil. Careful livestock management, and we do planned mob grazing, and I think, and I now started work with Claire, so I think Claire covered the mob grazing really well. We know we've got huge pea reserves on our farm and most farms in the Wye, and a part of the regenerative journey is actually looking at all the soil microbes, all the rhizosphere. How do we get that working, and actually taking this stored phosphate and making it available to all our plants, crops, and everything else. We haven't used any pea applications now for 6 years, and we have still got buckets of it, and we are trying to remove as much as we possibly can. We've also got a big focus on organic matter, and we banned the use of insecticides and nematicides 3 years ago. And when I put flood biology, basically what we try and do is enhance all of the biology that we can possibly have above ground and below ground, because if you end up with a flood of biology, the chances of a single species becoming dominant, which are potato cyst nematodes or your aphids or that sort of thing, is almost impossible. It's only when you create a vacuum of using nematicides or insecticides do you actually allow the first generation of pests, which are unfortunately what we classify as pests, to become established. Our potato crops look very different than most. We've got extra buffer strips. We don't do stone. We're using seaweed sugars, fleecing, companion crops. Synthetic fertilizers are cut by 80%. Massive reduction in irrigation. We just focus on plant health, insect health, soil health, and everything. And we're starting to see some really great results that I can present at another time. But the focus today, of course, is on the meadows, and it was Caroline Hanks that came across, and we had a long chat about recreating a Hereford a meadow, and a proper flower-rich meadow down that we call the withy beds. But the sort of person I am, I couldn't just sprinkle some seeds and hope that was going to be the answer. So I set up a matrix trial last year where we did 1 pass with a cultivator on the right-hand side, 2 passes with the cultivator, and 3 passes with the cultivator. And then we went across the other way with glyphosate at ½ a litre, a litre, and 2 litres. We know that the symbiotic relationship of grass to soil is quite problematic when you're trying to re-establish a hay meadow. There needs to be some physical or some kind of interference in that symbiotic relationship in order to establish something else. And the results were quite impressive, really, in so much as it didn't need a huge amount of cultivation, and it certainly didn't need a huge amount of glyphosate. Where we did nothing at all, and there are plenty of squares there which have got the red stars on it, we planted a huge density of seed. Very, very little grew. And that was what I expected. We have to cause some disturbance, and I'm sure glyphosate has got the big bad press. But in actual fact, we put it in this trial just to see how it would establish. Somewhere in the middle ground, so a pass, 2 passes, perhaps plus or minus a litre of glyphosate, is something we found to be the best results in terms of getting what we wanted. This is the sort of method by which we plant our hay meadows, and I find it really important that our seed was brush seed harvested from upriver. What I didn't want to do is go and buy a load of seed from a seed salesman that contained no species that would be normally growing in our river meadows. So what we were fortunate enough to do is be supplied with lots of seed from the Sturts, which is up the River Wye. And the method of spreading, we tried hundreds of different methods of spraying, and we found, in actual fact, standing in a trailer with the whole family, with the huge bags of seed in the trailer, driving up and down, sprinkling, really gave us some good results. It wasn't long, of course, that the river started to look like this. That is very much from the same place where I took that photograph. I've seen a lot of questions about, you know, is flooding a real problem? Is it getting worse? Is it losing diversity? And what's going on? Well, in actual fact, for those that go and inspect river meadows following flooding, these little creatures here are phenomenal in their numbers of repairing my soil health. I've never seen so many worm casts and worm activity within 24 hours of a flood event going down on our floodplain. The worms come, drain and aerate the soil, do everything they possibly can to just put that soil health back and stick it where it should be. So we're really thrilled with the worm populations we've got across the whole farm, but in particular on this river meadow. So this is what it started to look like in the sort of late winter, early spring. So you can see huge diversity of all grasses, yes, but other species in it too. And then by the time May came along, it was incredible. And I'll just flick through a few photographs because I'm sure we're all short of time. But we were thrilled by what we created just in this very first year. And that's something that I think goes a long way. What we also have now, which is quite thrilling, there were 5 grass snake observations in the river meadow this year. This one being the biggest lady of them all. We think she measured about 1.6 meters. So we were really, really pleased that we were starting to see things that we'd never seen before. So not only was it good for flowers and things like that, but we're starting to see species come back that we thought we didn't have. Then we start cutting for hay around the 25th of July. And we make sure the hay's well turned. That knocks a lot of the seed out. And I also saw a question about mob grazing from Geraint. And why couldn't we mob graze and then lock it up? You definitely can. What I'm trying to do here, Geraint, is actually just try and sprinkle as much seed back on the ground to try and get as much seed return going as we possibly can. Baled up, and as you can see, carted away. Then we came in with sheep. I've got 5 different flocks of rare breed sheep. We generally run them together until it's time for tupping. I'm a very big believer in rare breeds, and we've got quite a lot of rare breed, whether it's sheep, pigs, goats, horses, and everything else on the farm. And certainly rare breeds grazed on rich, diverse swards of our river ground produce some of the finest meat you'll eat. But closing the loop, well, it's really important. Like I said, the healthy, rich, diverse flood meadow is really good. What we're trying to do is multi-layer these enterprises. What I'm trying to do as a regenerative advisor and regenerative farmer is look at this, the fact that as farmers, you know, we farm sunlight, rain and carbon dioxide. That's free. We put it through a catalyst, and if the catalyst is working well, which is our soil, we make money. What we've got to do as farmers is start to think how far removed we've now become from that very, very simple method that is sunlight, rain, CO2, money. And that's me.
Ben, thank you so much. That was a brilliant presentation, and great to hear about all the innovative solutions you've come up with. I'm sure you're inspiring lots of people who are listening. So we're now going to go to our last presentation, and we're on time, which is great. We're going to Mark Wood, who's also a farmer in the Wye Valley, and he's taken Fawley Court Farm out of intensive arable production and made some of it into species-rich grassland. He's balancing making the farm profitable and wildlife friendly, and is going to talk to us about that journey. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Phoebe. Hopefully the screens come up correctly. I'll try and crack on because I realise everybody wants to go home for their teas and what have you. I'm Mark Wood, farm manager for the Clay family farms. For my sins, I'm actually a neighbour of Ben's, and we're certainly giving the Herefordshire broadband a bit of a testing tonight, so hopefully it will hold up. Clay Estates, it's the Brockhampton and Perrison Estates on the Wye Valley, part of the area of outstanding natural beauty. Mixed ownership, but it's all within the family. Total about 4,400 acres. There's woodland, tenant farmers, there's a full commercial shoot. And we've got diversifications like office lets, and there's 72 properties we quietly let out. The farming bit, which I actually look after, we're doing 3,500 acres. We haven't given up intensive arable farming. We still do grow arable crops on a large part of it. We've got 2,500 acres of arable, growing the crops listed there, mainly feed crops for the local feed markets, with human consumption, peas and beans, and small seed rape. We've also got the beef, because we've got a large area of permanent grass, which we don't want to plough. It's parkland, it's river meadows, too steep and all that sort of thing. And we run 100 calving cows. We've always had cattle running around here, and they were always continental crosses, and we always finished on a Marks and Spencer's contract, which was quite nice. And we've recently started direct sales, but I'll tell more of the story as we go on there. For a long time, we've been in environmental stewardship. It's met the owner's aims. We've always been told that we want to farm for the grandchildren. The current grandchildren aren't even conceived yet, but there's that long-term vision that we're trying to take to look after that ground and leave it for the next generation in better condition than what we're taking it on, and always looking at ways of improving. So environmental stewardship has enabled to do things quicker and on a larger scale. It's been good, but it's also fraught with many difficulties, with cutting dates, has been mentioned before, etc., etc. There's lots of hoops to jump through. Also trying to diversify the business. We have a commercial grain store storing for all the local farmers and providing that centralized storage. I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey as to why we've been changing some of the things we've been doing on particularly our floodplains, and we'll come back around to this floodplain meadows. It's been talked about spuds before, and it's a bit of a test for Kate, because I'm sure she'll recognise most of these fields as she's been round. These are our neighbours' fields, and they do know their pictures are up here because it's an ongoing discussion we have with them. This was a tenant farmer who's given up this year. And these sandy loam soils, as Ben's always said, are really difficult to structure. If those organic matters have dropped, the soil doesn't want to hold in the field with traditional heavy trailers, destoning and everything else. So it all funnels down. Herefordshire is not flat, and it all funnels down. So it all comes down to a point in the field. And this is where our neighbours' soil was coming across our field, running down the valley. Down the bottom of the hill is the River Wye, and it's all funneling down there, and that is the problem. At a close-up, you see the rills being run and the soil coming off. And this was against everything the owners and ourselves want. It's against the whole philosophy of the estate of trying to look after it, and we're quite passionate about the River Wye as well. This is another neighbour, heavy flood event, and this is the water and the soil that was coming off. This is courtesy of David Throop of the Environment Agency, and it's 400 metres away from a main tributary to the River Wye. So it's that's the story of that water going down. You're never going to stop the flooding in these river valleys. This is a photo off the internet of the valley. It will always flood. We're getting more and more extreme weather, and it's going to continue. So we need to be able to cope with that. If those arable crops and what have you underneath that water, they'll be being decimated. The floods last year were quite terrible. Last year, through the wet weather, this is somebody Kate knows reasonably well, looked across, and you'll see in the distance that was all winter wheat sown after late dug potatoes. You can see it's the damage it's doing and not growing a crop, and this is what we wanted to get away with. Our river meadows weren't much better. They were all flooded, and this is the river meadows, which we've reverted, and you'll see a picture of them in a bit, but that river, we can't stop it. It's what's happening upstream. We can't stop that water coming out, so it's how we manage that. And the reason when I started in 2003 here that I was set the challenge, because those river meadows you can see on that picture were all in high intensity, high tillage rotation, and it went wheat, potatoes, wheat, sugar beet, and it kept that rotation very tight, very intensive agriculture. My beautiful assistant, who was also my wife, luckily, is there. You'll see her hand quietly just hovering by her waist. That was the height of the field when originally, and Mr. Clay used to drive down there and go off fishing quietly, and we've lost that much soil. Nearly 3 foot of soil has been lost off that field. So in 2003, I was set the challenge to make sure that soil, the soil that Mr. Clay owned, stayed on that field and all our river meadows and what have you. So we used stewardship to develop some grassland, and hopefully we're going to wet it up. And unfortunately, one of the problems with stewardship, it was based around prescriptions for the River Severn. River Severn will flood and stay out for a long period of time with the water holding there, leaving water behind, so wading birds and everything else can benefit. The River Wye will come up, flood today, be gone tomorrow. It'll be dry, so it didn't achieve anything. We got grassland, yes, we'd stop the soil, but we weren't adding that biodiversity. We needed to increase. So these are the river meadows, same place as I stood before. This is in the summer, and you can see the river meadows. You can see the scale. There's 50 odd acres just in that block there, and we've reverted that back to grassland, and it's for grazing, looking after. You can see the river on the right-hand side winding its way down, all the way down towards Ben. So as we review the stewardship, we weren't happy. We were taking stewardship payments and it helped. And yes, we got a cut of low quality grass off it, which was fine for the cows. But actually, we weren't adding anything, and we were taking the stewardship money and not giving anything back to nature. So we looked at enhancing them, floristically enhancing, getting more diversity, species, whether it's just plants, also for the animals, as Ben said, insects and everything else. So for that, there's a lot of excitement about the best way to establish a river meadow. I think a lot comes down to the season, the sward that's already there, and the machines and tools that you've got at your disposal. People say you've got to have this machine, or you must green strew hay. It comes down to what you've got and what you can actually do on your piece of ground and what seed you can get. We've been lucky enough, some of this was funded by Natural England, and they told us a very prescriptive seed mixture, which wasn't the best. And Emma Rothero has been out and surveyed it, and there's mixed results with that. But over time, in partnership with others, Herefordshire Meadows, Plantlife, we've been adapting what we're doing and trying to improve the different things. This is the same field, and this is in summer. You can see the biodiversity. It's not just cocksfoot grasses and the original grass that we had. We've got all those wildflowers, full diversity, and it's really quite good. Unfortunately, being a river meadow, these aren't dwarfs. These are normally tall people, and you can see the fertility that's adding into the grass. And we've got the problem, there is a lot there. We are having to adapt the management as we go. So all in the past, we've been cutting around about July and then graze the aftermath. This year, we're going to be trying to graze it earlier to keep it down, and maybe take a very late cut of hay to try and open up that grassland again to keep those wildflowers the dominant part of it. With our establishment, we've, like Ben, found the dreaded Roundup. Everybody's very critical of chemicals, but a little bit of it will just open up that pasture, allowing the little seeds to establish, and it holds the grass to give everything else a chance to go. So we use that. We'll also use the machines that we've got. We've got some very good, we use a stubble rake. People look at us like we've gone mad, but actually it opens it up slightly. It shows that little bit of soil without bringing all the weeds up and stuff. It's always important for us, and reflecting what Ben says, you're joining up the circle. So it's all right growing all this grass, wildflowers, herb britchlays and everything else, but something's got to use it. There's no point in growing it just for nature. We need a use. So we developed our breeding and we've gone back to the Devons, the Devon cattle, native breed, and they thrive on this sort of grassland. They absolutely love it. They live on it nearly all year round. The only cake they get or concentrate feed is a little bit around calving and little to bribe them. I'm very jealous of Clare's large fields where you can mob graze. We've got lots of little pastures where we can't particularly be moving fences, we haven't got the water, so on and so forth. So we do have to block graze on the little pastures, and we need to bribe them to come out. So they do get a little bit of cake, just so they're friendly towards us. And it's allowed us to adapt rather than going commercial, sending to an abattoir and going off to a supermarket, whether it's Marks and Spencer's or whoever. We now do our own direct marketed beef. So this is the product we're growing off of the herb-rich lays, the enhanced river meadows and what have you. So it's joining that circle together. So we're meeting all the aims of keeping the soil in the field, using a bit of stewardship to help us do that, enhancing the biodiversity through plants, insects and everything else. A lot of monitoring goes on with that to make sure we're doing the job right. And eventually it comes through the cattle into something that's marketable that will help the business move forward. And if there's any questions, I'd welcome them, or just send me an email. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mark. Again, a really fascinating presentation. I was just shocking to see those images of soil loss, and I can't believe that that field had lost 3 foot of soil. Incredible thought. And also just generally, I thought those presentations were so interesting. We've had absolutely tons of questions, and everyone's done a great job of answering them. So if people watching, if you've asked a question, you might see it's already been answered in the answered section. And I'm going to group together questions that haven't been answered shortly. But first, we're going to do our 3rd poll. So hopefully that's going to flash up now. And then I think Emma and Olivia are going to speak briefly about the findings of the poll.
Can I just wait until people have answered, because it looks like I have to wait for this 3rd poll to be answered, and then
okay, shall I get cracking with the first set of questions?
Yes, and then I'll put my hand up or something.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to start. I've got kind of 3 batches of questions for Claire, Ben and Mark. So the first lot for Claire, lots of people asking for more practical info about how you do what you do. So how long do you leave stock on for high density grazing? Generally a few people interested in stocking density. Do you use specific breeds for floodplain grazing? And the third question is, how do you expect the mob grazing to work with ground nesting waders that your meadows are so important for?
Okay, so I'll start with breeds. I don't think it matters which breed, but selection for animals which do well off pasture, I guess. So probably the continentals maybe aren't going to thrive as well in these systems. So we use a combination of our base herd is Solaires. We cross them with an Angus and a stabilizer. And so we're always selecting for easy calving, and doing well off grass and a low maintenance system. So that's not just relevant to the meadows, that's the way that we want to run. I noticed there was a question actually linked to that on how quickly are we finishing our animals. We finish them in between 18 and 24 months, and in fact since we removed grain from our diets, our finishing has speeded up since we brought more diversity into our grazing. I'll go on to the wading birds question, and then you'll have to remind me of the first because I didn't write it down. Because the animals are, so I don't have a definite answer, isn't like I can't prove this, but what we notice is that we maybe don't give animals the credit that they deserve sometimes, and that when there's a nest, they don't stand on it. And also that the animals are only in each area for such a short period of time. That the disturbance is minimal. And the other thing to say is that with the picture I showed you was of our winter grazing, where we are taking more material away. I should have on reflection, should have showed you a picture of our summer grazing, where the residual that we're leaving behind is sort of 2,500 kilograms of dry matter minimum. So we're leaving a big residual, which means that the material needed for the ground nesting birds is still there. Can you remind me of the first question, Phoebe? I totally forgot.
Great. The first question is, how long do you leave stock on for high density grazing?
About 2 days. We find for us, that was a balance of practicality with fences. The way in which we're reducing the amount of electric fencing that we have to do is by grouping our animals together more. So we used to have lots of little management groups, and now we've got everything running, all our sheep run together as one. All of our cattle this year will run together as one group. So that's the way in order to reduce the amount of fencing that we have to do. But yeah, about 2 days works for us. Brilliant.
Great. And Emma and Olivia, do you want to talk about the poll now, or shall I ask another set of questions?
We've got about 40% of people have already voted on the last one. It would be nice if some more could, so we could get a really good feel for sort of where people's feelings are on this. I might, if you want to ask the next question, and then I'll do it, I promise.
Yeah. Okay, great. So over to Ben now. Questions, what cover crop mixes do you use? Would heavy grazing have the same effect as glyphosate? Are you using insecticides? And how long are your fields flooded for? I think you're on mute, Ben.
Sorry. Right.
There you go.
Yeah, sorry about that. Right. What cover crops do I use? I generally use, if people are familiar with Dr. Caligari, who's probably the world leading expert from Brazil on cover crops. And as long as you use a mixture of cereals, grasses, brassicas, quinopods, and legumes, you have an absolutely amazing thing that happens in soil. It literally, if you've got any of those five going on in your soil, it does a great job. If you happen to lose one of those things, for whatever reason, it doesn't quite do what you really hope cover crops do. So as diverse as you possibly can, but make sure those 5 groups are all represented in there. I could talk about cover crops for about 2 or 3 hours, to be honest. Depending on what crop you are going to follow with will depend on what ratios I plant. So if I'm going into a spring cereal, for instance, I wouldn't have a huge amount of cereals or grasses in a overwinter cover crop. If I'm going into a legume, then I would reduce the legumes right down as well. We find that black oats and the likes of those sort of things in cover crops, and even spelt for that matter, can have a real detrimental effect on the establishment of spring barley. So or spring oats or anything like that. So there's definitely some issues there. That was the first question. Second question, I didn't write any of it down, I'll be honest.
Glyphosate, would heavy grazing have the same effect as glyphosate, and are you using insecticides?
Don't use any insecticides at all, and glyphosate is something I don't want to use. Glyphosate, I've done a lot of research on it and things, and we've cut the rate hugely where we need to use it by using citric acid and fulvic acid with them to negate the problems on the soil. Heavy grazing, definitely. We're trying that with sheep. We're trying that with cattle. We're even trying that with pigs. We're trying overwinter. We're trying all sorts of things and even chickens in the chicken tractor. Leave them a little bit longer. See if we can scratch that ground up enough. So there's definitely the problem is trying to manage everything as well as you possibly can. The trouble is, farming is very much weather dependent, and if you know you've got a weather event coming in and you want to establish some grass, and who knows, it could be the last time of doing it, you can't speed animals up. And we had that problem this autumn, to be fair, where I really wanted to use the sheep and the goats to really hammer the grass down tight, and realized the grass was still growing far too fast for the animals to really do what I wanted them to do. unfortunately, you know, the practicality says a litre of glyphosate did exactly what I needed it to do at that time. It's not something I rely on, and it's not something I promote, and it's something we're desperately trying to get away from, and I'm sure Mark's doing exactly the same. And we're researching, believe me, on understories of clover and all sorts of things in cereals and long-term permanent understories of covers and green mulches and everything we possibly can. But sometimes, unfortunately, and this is why I'm not organic, we do reach for a little bit of glyphosate.
Okay, great. And final question for you is, how long are your fields flooded for?
I think Mark covered that, and we're very lucky on the Wye. The Wye is quite steep, certainly through our areas, and generally, I think 1988 was a time when it flooded for a few weeks, but generally it comes up as fast as it goes down, and if only we could stop it coming up quite so fast, we might not have the problem in the first place. That's the responsibility of everybody in the Wye Valley, to increase carbon and actually start becoming a sponge. You know, if 1 kilo of carbon can hold 17.5 kilos of water, I think it'd be really useful to concentrate on building carbon. So yeah, we could actually probably really reduce the amount of flooding we have anyway. But that you know, why wouldn't you want to put carbon in your system as a farmer? No idea.
Great. Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you. And now, Emma and Olivia, do you want to do the poll, or should I do more questions? I've got more.
No, Phoebe, no, Phoebe, that's all right. Sorry, thank you. Thank you for giving us a bit of time. Right, what I'll do is, I'm not sure if I share the results, you'd actually see them. So I'll talk through it very quickly and then share the results. So the first one we asked people about was whether any of the audience manage floodplain land, and I would say about 63% of you don't manage floodplain land and 37% of you do. And then going down to whether you manage a meadow in the floodplain, again, it was more people who didn't, 67%, and about 33% said yes. Then we asked on the second, we asked people if they've got a floodplain meadow in a stewardship scheme, and it's a very, very low amount. It's only about 19% of people said yes, so 79 people do, and most people don't. And then the question, which I don't know if changes again, but we asked people if they have any plans to restore or create a floodplain meadow. It's almost half. It's almost half. It's about 44% of you said yes, and 56% of you said no. And then coming on to the last question, we wanted to get a feel, and it'd be useful to send it on now as we sort of ELM scheme gets further developed. But we asked those people who are in a stewardship scheme whether they find these schemes for meadows unsatisfactory, and we gave various reasons for why. So we asked people to sort of multiple choice. The biggest reason, actually, about 44% of you said it was defined hay cutting dates, which is something we're talking about much more flexible hay cutting. Other big issues were around grazing restrictions, was around an insufficient incentive for meadow management, which is compared to other options. A lot of you thought too much for filling a sea, and then 39% of you said none of the above. So not sure, whatever that is. Any comments on that in chat would be really welcome. But what I'll do now is I'll just share the results, and hopefully people will see those. But thank you very much, everyone.
That's great. Thanks, Olivia. And on to the last set of questions for Mark. How long ago was your field 3 foot higher? What would be your approach to getting mainstream farmers to follow your mindset? I think that's a very interesting question. And is there pressure on river meadows to become wetlands to mitigate flooding further downstream? And actually also one more question for you, Mark, which is after the flooding in 2019, 2020, did you need to do anything to alleviate the compaction, subsoiling, or kickstart growth? Not exactly sure what that means, but yeah, over to you.
That's fine, thank you, Phoebe. There's one other question I saw Ross scrolling around, criticising me for not using English red wine in the picture of the beef. All I can say is I'm a poor farmer, and it was a freebie bottle I was given, and it was closest to hand when taking a photo. So apologies for that. I'll try and use English next time. 3 foot higher, that was it dropped over about 15 years up to 2003, and it was that very intense high in cultivation and beating that soil down into seabeds that had happened, and summer floods will take an awful lot of, and it's the speed of the water that comes down the Wye. So it happened over a period of time up to 2003. You asked about the mindset of other farmers. It's getting there. There is an awful lot more understanding. I would encourage farmers not to try and worry about labels, whether it's a regenerative, organic, whatever it might be. It's a journey. All of us are on a journey trying to get there, and people can get too hung up sometimes with labels. I think it's trying to improve. Once you see that soil leaving your field, once you see the problems you're having, it's getting that conversation going as to how to improve it, how to increase your organic matters, your soil resilience. And none of us are perfect. We all make mistakes, if you know what I mean, and it's learning from those mistakes. There's lots of quotes going around about a definition of a fool. A fool is a person who keeps doing the same thing every year and expect something to change. So if you have got a problem with your soil, and people are seeing it now, and through AHDB Monitor Farms, it's been quite encouraging how many farmers are engaging and looking to improve. They're seeing that as a natural asset, and that's going to become more critical as direct payments come off and farming becomes a lot tighter. We need to look after that resource that is the soil. Mentioned wetlands. Natural England was so excited about getting wetlands down on the River Wye, and we were going to have all these lovely nesting birds and so on and so forth. The River Wye dries out too quickly. You can't hold the water in there, and a lot of these breeding waders need that water away from the fast-flowing river to be able to paddle and get their insects, what have you. So we're not getting the pressure from a biodiversity point of view. There is discussion about using, they do use our farmland as flood defences for Ross and Wye, Hereford. So they use the floodplains to fill up with water, to buffer, to slow it down going through the towns to save people's homes. It gets very frustrating. We're getting an awful lot more floods because of all the building. There's no compensation at all. We just have to put up with it. And it's a way of, one of the reasons you have to start changing your farming. You know you're going to get these floods a lot more regular. There ought to be some more joined up thinking as to way to hold water. I know Kate's doing an awful lot of work up in the upper reaches with leaky dams and lots of other schemes to try and slow the flow, as they call it. But down here, there's nothing happening because we're at the bottom. And if you're going to slow the flow and try and stop that water, you need to start at the top and then gradually work down as you come. Compaction after the floods, no. As Ben showed, the worms do the work for us. Compaction, we find, comes from heavy machinery used at the wrong time. We do use big tractors, and we'll go and cut the hay with a 150 horsepower tractor that probably weighs 6 tons, but we're not using it in the wet, so it's not putting the compaction there. If you've just had the water running across it, the worms and the biology in the soil, the roots that are living there will sort the compaction out for you.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Mark. I just want to pick up on one last question. We've just got 5 minutes left. This is for anyone who has any insight into this, but it's from Richard Hill. Does anyone know what incentives there will be for creating floodplain meadows post-Brexit? Any insight on that? I
would say Brexit has no bearing on creation of flood meadows at all. Agricultural policy is more key with the agricultural bill. You've got to be passionate about it. Creating floodplain meadows is not simple. Especially if you're trying to enhance it with flowers, you've got to pay that attention to detail, use those opportunities and be passionate about it. Like Ben's described, going out there, involving the family is a great way to do it. We're fortunate that we've got a team of staff here that are really good for it. There are incentives through stewardship, which are still there, and they'll transfer into elms. Exactly where elms will be, nobody knows at the moment, but I don't think Brexit is, I think that's a bit of a red herring to do with floodplain meadows.
And I'd just add to that, Mark, I think there's emerging markets supporting land management. You know, I've already got partnerships in the pipeline with corporate companies looking to do biodiversity offsetting. You know, people like Glade Botanica, who are going to be working with us and Herefordshire Meadows Group to do species rich and meadow creation as part of their corporate responsibility. And I think there's a huge scope for those sorts of things in terms of biodiversity offsetting. I know there's a huge amount of pressure in terms of that for house building and those sorts of markets too. So we just have to broaden our horizons. Our money might not just come from the government, but actually there is a huge number of people who would support these kind of management interventions, and we just need to get savvy at making sure we're marketing ourselves in the right way and showing what we're capable of delivering for other people.
Anyone got anything else they'd like to add on that topic?
Mm-hmm. Just to agree with Mark, really, that we don't know what elm will do specifically in terms of meadows, but if it does what it promised and gives public money for public goods, then meadows should be top of the list because of the wide range of ecosystem services they deliver. So we're hopeful, and we are trying to lobby DEFRA to that effect, but DEFRA are playing their cards very close to their chest at the moment, so I'm not sure any of us really know what elm will look like.
That's great. Does anyone else want to add anything on that question? Okay, well, just a huge thank you to all of our panelists this evening. I think it's been such an interesting talk, and really interesting hearing the practical solutions people are just cracking on with. And so thank you very much for those fascinating presentations. Thanks to Emma and Olivia for organising this and putting it all together. There's been a few people asking in the chat about watching this back, and it's going to go up on the PFLA YouTube page, I think in a day or two's time, so you can watch it back then, and also please share it with people who couldn't be here this evening or who might be interested in this sort of topic. And then just lastly, thank you to all of you for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed it and feel inspired by some of what you've heard. Thank you very much and have a nice evening.